competition, low carbon transition, climate change, the digital transformation, and how these key issues are going to affect the dynamics and outcome of trade within and across regions. After the pandemic, many countries are facing common challenges: distorted and tense trade relations, shortages of critical goods, especially semiconductors, and increased pressure to make supply chains more secure, sustainable, and resilient. In light of these trends, the panel would examine how the UK can best drive investment, growth, and job creation to 2030. Our keynote speaker is Bruce Stokes, who is a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And from 2019 to 2021, he was the executive director of the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Task Force, which produced the report Together or Alone: Choices and Strategies for Transatlantic Relations for 2021 and beyond. So I'd like to welcome you, Bruce. Thank you for being with us here today. And I will turn to you to kick things off, please. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be with you all. Alex and James Ellis have often spoken to me about this conference, so I'm really pleased to be part of the group today. What I'm going to do is very briefly share with you some data points based on economic data and public opinion data, just to actually kick us off in terms of what we can see in terms of what's happening and what we're likely to see in the future. And then we can dig in, I think, in the conversation to more of the details about the prospects for job growth in the new economy. So if we could go to the first slide, that'd be great. So these are the IMF forecasts for global EU, US, and UK growth through 2025. And I think what's most illuminating about this is that the world has, at least certainly since 2000, grown faster than the US and the UK and the EU, which is probably not surprising, but in large part that's been driven by Chinese growth, and to a certain extent in recent years, Indian growth. But what is more striking from this is that we probably need to adjust our expectations about global growth. As you can see, it has been more or less on a similar path going back to 1980. There hasn't been wide disparities in growth, and it's been in the range of about a few percentage points to 5 percentage points. So this is what we probably have to expect for the future, whether we would like more growth or not. But of course, as you only know so well, minus 0.3% growth for the UK this year is not good, to say the least, and it's an issue obviously you're all wrestling with. And the 0.7% growth for the EU is not great. The US is growing slightly stronger, but still 1.6% is not that great. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is an analysis by the Congressional Budget Office on not only the US performance since 1950, but also what contributed to it. And it seems to me that's what's really illuminating, is that the contribution of the potential labor force. As you know, growth is a product of the growth of the labor force plus productivity. And from 1974 to 1981, for example, the labor force grew by 2.5% per year. So it contributed strongly to the fairly strong economic growth the U.S. had of 3.2% average over that time period. I must acknowledge that's when I graduated from college, and it never crossed my mind that I couldn't find a job because there was a lot of growth. That's obviously not the case anymore for a lot of people. But as you can see, maybe the labor force growth is something that is harder to control. The productivity growth, which has slowed in the United States, is something I think that's more troubling. And for basically the last more than a decade now, decade and a half, the productivity has only grown at about 1.8% a year, which is slower than in the past, and something that we hope technology can contribute to in terms of automation and AI and other things to improve productivity, but that's yet to be proven. Next slide. If there's one thing it seems to me we should take away from the conversation is that our expectations about China and its economy and its economic contribution to global growth and to the growth of all of our domestic economies has to be adjusted. As you can see, the the expected growth looking at 2022 is only 3%. The Chinese are ambitiously saying it's going to be a little higher this year. I would say that the economists who study China that I trust the most say no, it's likely to be somewhere between 0% and 3% for years to come. There are a combination of problems that the Chinese economy faces. Probably the biggest problem is that it's still a state-led economy. It's dependent on exports. It's not dependent upon domestic consumer consumption. A huge savings rate among the Chinese population, which suggests they don't trust the future. The Chinese have not been successful in getting their consumers to spend some of their savings and drive the economy in that way. Bear in mind, in the US, 60% of all growth comes from consumer consumption. That's not the case in China. Compounding that is a huge overhang of debt from the real estate sector, which they've been using in speculation in real estate as a driver of the economy in recent years. That's got to stop and has stopped. And of course, they have a shrinking population. And now they have the problem of 1 out of 5 young people are unemployed, which is a political cauldron, which the Chinese are going to have to manage and is politically destabilizing, potentially at least. So I think all of our thinking about the future of the world economy, the future of economic growth, let alone the kind of policy implications in foreign policy and domestic and military policy and strategic policy, are going to have to be adjusted because China, that we assumed was going to surpass the United States as the largest economy in the world, very likely will not. And what that means for all of us, and including Chinese behavior in the world, we just don't know, but we have to, I think, really factor that now into our thinking in a way that we hadn't now for years. Next slide. In the post-war era, the expansion of global trade has often been the driver of economic growth. And as you can see in recent years, in the last a little over a decade, there are a number of times in 2021, in 2017, the dark blue, which is merchandise trade, actually grew faster than global GDP. And what has changed in recent years is, as you can see in 2020, again in 2023, to a lesser extent in 2022, the slowdown in global trade actually held back global economic growth. And while for next year, for example, the WTO, where these figures come from, expects merchandise trade to actually grow a little bit faster than global growth, economic growth. What you have seen is, I think, a reversal of a post-war pattern. And I guess the question we have to think about as we go forward is that are there impediments to global trade that are, as a result, adversely affecting global economic growth? And can we remove those impediments? Or have we reached some kind of natural limit where global trade is not going to grow with the kind of speed that it did in the past? And bear in mind, we've gotten rid of most of the formal trade barriers that used to impede trade. Average tariffs on goods are about 3% or less in most countries. We've been successful in that vein. So the question is, are there other impediments that are holding back trade and thus holding back economic growth? And how do we address those? Next slide. What is encouraging is the growth in digital delivered services. Now, this is a log scale, so it's not, it doesn't show volume, it doesn't show value. The value and volume of global merchandise exports, for example, still exceeds that of digitally delivered services. But you can see that digitally delivered services is growing at a much faster rate than goods exports or other service exports. What we have not addressed, though, is the challenges that are posed by digitally delivered service exports. Questions about privacy, questions about are these services, do they have embedded in them information which may be proprietary? And a big issue, which frankly nobody wants to address, is that you can tax goods, you can tax traditional services easier. How do you tax digitally delivered services? The EU has attempted to do this. The US has been adamantly opposed to it. But the challenge is that if we move increasingly towards digitally delivered services, there's a good chance that people will lose their jobs as a result of that, or people will need retraining as a result of that. And how do we pay for that? And the way we've done that, not adequately, but the way we've done that with, say, goods trade is we can tax those goods and we can use those proceeds, hopefully, to help people transition. Without taxes on digitally delivered services, how do we address the needs that are created by that kind of trade? And that's one of the issues I think that still challenges us going forward. Next slide. You well know, I mean, one of the results of the challenge posed by China, the challenge posed by climate change, the challenges posed by the COVID experience have led to a rebirth of industrial policy across the Western world. It never died, obviously, in China. The US has been leading the way. The Biden administration has embraced industrial policy in a way that the US has not really since the Roosevelt administration. A principal way of pursuing that industrial policy has been through subsidies. So this is a study released just last month by Global Trade Alert out of St. Gallen in Sweden and Switzerland, I mean. And you can see that across the board, whether it's in food, less so say than Canada, but Canada's number 2, certainly in critical raw materials, CRMs, in global value chains, especially, the US has delivered far more subsidies than anyone else. I must say I am struck that Canada's number 2 in many of these categories. I was surprised at that, but there is the old phrase of, too far from God and too close to the United States. I think that's Canada's problem. But clearly, countries are engaging in a great deal of subsidization. We can talk about what's driving that. And certainly in the global value chains and in the critical raw materials area, it's a big issue. Next slide. And this is the growth in subsidies of critical raw materials over time and over just really the last year or so. And as you can see, the distortive domestic subsidies for critical raw materials, which is that light blue or whatever, however you want to call the color, basically far exceeds the other kinds of policies that address critical raw materials. So subsidizing critical raw materials is a major driver of the industrial policy going forward. And for those of us who worry about the distortive effects of subsidies, I think it's incumbent upon people who criticize those to come up with alternative ways to have access to critical raw materials, because critical raw materials will be such an important aspect of how we address climate change through batteries and through electric vehicles, et cetera, windmills. And I think that right now, we don't have an answer to that. And so we're subsidizing a transition on these critical raw materials. If there is another way, we need to come up with it, but we don't have it right now. Next slide. Obviously, automation is a long-standing problem in all economies in terms of the transitions it imposes on people. This is a 3 or 4 year old survey of the United States, but I think it holds even today. Americans think it has done more harm than good. And if you stop and think about it, going back even to the opposition to trade back in the 70s and 80s in the United States, General Motors and Ford did not put robots on the floor of their factories in Detroit because they loved robots. They did it because robots are more efficient. They create products with less defects than human beings. And the Japanese were the first to get there in terms of automation. Ford and General Motors and European automakers had to catch up. And that required the introduction of robots and other kind of automated procedures. And that's a process that's going to continue, I think, going forward. And people understand that automation has hurt them in their lives. Next slide. This is an interesting and I think great way to close, because we have to think about the political implications of all of these issues we've been talking about. This was a survey done by Pew in the United States, where people were asked what impact automation was going to have. And basically, people thought other people's jobs were going to be threatened by automation, fast food workers, insurance claim processors, whatever. But they didn't think their own job was going to be threatened by automation. And I can tell you that could be the source of new populist backlash going forward, because especially with AI, I think there is no reason to believe that any of our jobs are safe. And if you think that your job is not going to be affected by automation and by new technologies, and then it is, you're going to be particularly upset. As long as you think it's someone else's problem and not your problem, maybe you can tolerate. But once it's your problem, it becomes a political issue, which is going to beset all of our societies going forward. And with that cheery note, I will finish and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Bruce. Bruce, that was really, really fantastic. And I was particularly struck by that last slide that you showed. I mean, a lot of what drove public attitudes towards trade and negative attitudes towards trade and trade liberalization was as a result of adding emerging economies such as China to the global trading system, and the impact that that had on jobs, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And if people are not expecting in future that their jobs will be under threat, and they find out that eventually they are, I think that's a very concerning development. But thank you. We turn now to our second speaker, Sam Lowe, who's a director at Flint Global. Partner at Flint Global in London. Sam is a leading European trade expert who regularly advises government officials, ministers, parliamentarians, and companies on issues such as trade and services, regulatory barriers to trade, rules of origin and trade, and the environment. He also writes an excellent weekly Substack trade newsletter, which for anyone in the trade world is required reading, and I recommend all of you sign up to it as well. But Sam, would you like to respond to Bruce?
Yes, thank you very much. And I might actually just start on where we ended in terms of perceptions, because I think one of the interesting points to note is that despite there sort of being a general assumption in lots of the political and public debate that UK attitudes to trade are more akin to US attitudes than, say, the French or Germans or Europeans. Actually, when surveyed on concerns about trade, their answers are very European. Fear of job losses is really actually quite low down the list. The number one is always sort of food standards or environmental. And this is quite in line with what you find across Europe. And I suppose I'm making this point now because the focus of what I'm going to talk about is this question of where does the UK sit? And I was wondering if I could somehow stretch out that fabulous quote from Bruce to, too far from God and somewhere between Europe and the United States for the UK. And I'm not sure it quite works, but this question of where the UK sits, I think, is quite important. And we can start from this comparator of the US. And if we look at how the US behaves in terms of its external trade policy right now, it's quite unilateralist, lots of tariffs, not that interested in global rules in terms of its approach to the WTO, and the reason the WTO is not working isn't exclusively the US's fault, but the US plays quite a big part in that. And why can it get away with that? And my sort of very simplistic answer is it's because if you actually look at the US's reliance on international trade, so here I mean total trade, so imports and exports as a percentage of GDP, it's really low, surprisingly low. So if you look at the World Bank sort of figures on this, I think from 2020, bearing in mind not all countries are recorded, so there are countries with lower percentages, but I think the only two countries with lower reliance on international trade by that metric was South Sudan and Cuba. And then you had the US was around, so total trade accounted for about 20% of GDP. The UK is more like 50%. And I think this is important. The UK is much more reliant on global trade than the US. And in a sense, that does feed into what sorts of policies the UK advocates for, what it needs, and also the pain it's willing to take, because many of these US unilateral measures are painful. They're just not that painful, taking into account how strong the US economy is, how strong its consumer base is, and you could argue it's bearable. I mean, if you think the US sort of is arguably not quite self-sufficient, but close to in energy, food, the UK just doesn't have that. So for the UK, a country that's reliant on international investment, global openness, a rules-based approach, its policy priorities and objectives are naturally going to be quite different and more similar to countries, say Japan. You don't have to just look at Europeans. You can find countries all over the world who are in a similar sort of bucket where they say, actually, we quite like rules-based trade, not that fond of unilateralism, and we're now struggling to think of what to do. And the UK, I would say, is particularly vulnerable in terms of a subsidy race. So Bruce was discussing the sort of increase in subsidies and subsidisation recently. And I think my argument here is basically that the UK is caught between the US, if you're looking at a map, to its left, and the EU to its right, and sort of to its left if you include Ireland. But and fiscally, the UK has constraints. I think have been well discussed over the last couple of years, and it just can't spend as much as the US or the EU as a collective, although it could arguably spend the same sort of levels as individual member states. So therefore a subsidy race just isn't in the UK's interest. But with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the European Green Deal, that's what we're having. And the fear is, I think, and this is what the government fears, and from talking to companies, it's definitely happening to a degree, is that it pulls investment out of the UK. So investment that would otherwise have been in the UK will happen elsewhere. It's hard to fully work out the dynamics of this because I think lots of companies are taking money for things they would have done anyway. so there's a lot of waste. But there is still a degree of this. And companies are certainly subsidy shopping, where you say, oh, we're thinking of investing in the UK if you give us this amount of money, but the South Koreans have offered us this, the Americans have offered us this, and the Germans have offered us this. And in most instances, the UK hasn't been willing to play that game, in part because it can't. There's then, I would just add in the impact of the new trade dynamic. It's not new, but it's sort of more prominent around national security and how national security and economic security feeds into the decisions taken, particularly vis-a-vis trade with China, although, of course, this has been felt most acutely recently with regards of Russia. Although, as an aside, I would note it's been quite easy on the most part for companies to pull out of Russia because it was so inconsequential in terms of their sort of revenues. And you'll note that the companies that were much more exposed and it was much more relevant have tended to find ways to stay in. China, in that context, has proven much more tricky. And the UK, of course, as a sort of global security actor, has wanted to play its part in terms of export controls, investment screening, and the like. But it's arguably much more consequential for the UK economy than it is, say, for the US. And I think getting that balance right has been something that the government here has been struggling with. We've seen sort of announcements about being really tough on one instance, and then we've seen sort of trips to China the next saying, actually, we want to have this bifurcated approach. And I mean, the US has been doing this to a degree as well. I think it's just much harder for the UK to do. And in terms of the trade environment getting worse, you just sort of think, well, what are the UK's main markets? So the US has been getting more difficult. You then have Europe. And actually, putting Brexit to one side, so exiting the EU's customs union single market, moving to the trade and cooperation agreement, means that structurally the trade relationship with Europe is worse, but it's sort of bedding in, and you have a free trade agreement. So, but even with that there, the EU is pursuing the whole swathe of unilateral measures, so its carbon border adjustment mechanism, foreign subsidies rules, which make it put new obligations on companies outside the EU when investing into the EU or engaging in procurement activities. You've got new supply chain due diligence rules, forced labour rules, you've got the international procurement instrument, you've got deforestation rules. And these all are individually justifiable pieces of legislation. So deforestation, no one likes illegal deforestation, so you impose some rules on companies to ensure that they can adequately demonstrate that their products are deforestation free. But that's a cost on the company. And you bunch all of those obligations together and the cost of exporting to the EU goes up. And that's true for UK firms as well as everyone else. US, much more difficult. You have tariffs, you just have the sort of concern over what happens after the next election. Not quite as easy. China was one of the alternative markets discussed during Brexit, and now that's just not as easy as it was now. I mean, there's lots of companies in this part of the world that were selling a lot, and by this part of the world I mean Oxford. If we think sort of scientific companies, scientific instruments, companies engaged with research institutions that are doing a lot of business with China, that's become much more difficult than it used to be, even in the case of long-established relationships for not necessarily sensitive goods, just because of changes to the export control regime in the UK. So, but to sort of take it beyond the sort of doom and gloom, you then, I think, have to think about, okay, so what does the UK do about this? And it's not an easy question, but I think in terms of a strategic approach, there are areas where the UK has structural advantages, some of it based on geography. So if we think about renewables, so green tech, UK has very large tides, lots of wind. So in terms of deployment, the UK is a really good place to deploy, say, floating offshore wind. So the next, I know wind isn't actually a good example right today or yesterday, given the failure of the recent auction. But if we take a longer term perspective, structurally the UK has an advantage there in terms of deployment. So the question is, can it actually capture some of the industry that goes with it without engaging in sort of Inflation Reduction Act style local content requirements, discriminatory subsidisation and type? And the answer is probably it can, if you have sensible policy around that. I think there's then the resilience point. The UK doesn't want to be overly reliant on any one market. If those market closes, you want to be able to have alternatives. This has been the sort of trade policy of Australia and New Zealand for years after it felt the pain of UK entry into the EU and being shut out of the UK market. And this is where the sort of more classic trade agenda comes in. It's sort of saying, well, can we deepen our trade relationships with as many countries as possible, reduce barriers so there's alternatives in case our companies get shut out of one. And then the third one I'd end on is just doing things well. And this is something that the UK has not been good at for the last few years. And what I mean here is there's this big disconnect between the political narrative of this is a great place to invest, great investor certainty, and the actual experience of companies investing in the UK, where there's huge amounts of uncertainty, there's new legislation coming through all the time that confuses them. Brexit didn't help with this, but it's settling down in terms of just a consistent narrative. And I think getting that right is quite important, because even to go back to, it's an area I know fairly well, so hence talking about it, but on the export control side, we want to be this hub for scientific innovation and equipment, yet our export controls regime is an absolute nightmare. And it's not to the point, the complaint isn't usually that we're being stopped from selling things to bad people. Most companies accept you shouldn't do that. The issue is, where in the ambiguous cases, in the grey area, why is it taking nearly a year to get a response about whether we're allowed to do something or not? This is all structural. You can tell people no quickly and it makes their lives much easier. You can give them clarity on what they're allowed to do and what they're not. But at the moment, it's just confusing. And I think that sort of challenge replicates throughout the economy in lots of different ways. And it's something that can be improved. So I'm ending on a positive note.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. Thanks. Definitely lots to pick up on there when we come to question and answer session. But I turn now to our final speaker, Dr. Owen Dreyer. Dr. Dreyer is a senior researcher at the Wilfrid Martin Centre, specialising in macroeconomic and social policy. He's an expert in the political economy of the European Union, focusing on the future of the Eurozone, EU-UK and EU-US relations, but also the socio-economic challenges facing middle-class families, which might be something of relevance, considering what we've heard so far. Dr. Dreyer, over to you.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. It is a Friday afternoon. We do have beautiful weather, so I'm going to try to be very optimistic, I think, today. I think, Bruce, Alex have set the scene nicely in terms of, look, we're going to be looking at lower growth. It's going to be too low to bring down debt. We're looking at stagnant productivity, which is too low to spur growth. The labour force is declining. China's in trouble, and let's face it, everybody was banking on China, who exports. But we have an increase in digital trade and we have an increase in automation, which should be good, but we don't know how many people are going to lose their jobs, and we don't know how we're really going to tax it and regulate it yet. So what I tried maybe to look at is a broader socioeconomic perspective, because I was struck by what Bruce said right at the end when he said, let's talk about the political implications and stuff. And basically, when we talk about the political implications, we're just talking about people, and we're talking about how secure or insecure people feel, because that's reflected in their preferences on election day. And there's really kind of, I think, four big questions that some have been asked before. One is, how are we going to pay for these transformations, climate, digitalization, etc. 2, the demographics in the developed world are terrible. Where are the workers going to come from? 3, we need to talk about education and reskilling, because not everybody needs to know how to code. Not everybody's going to be an AI expert, but they probably will need to know how to use a bit of basic AI, how to use some basic tech. And the 4th question is the geopolitical question, is how close, we're hearing a lot at the moment about friendshoring, and it's like, but it's how close do you want to be to your friends in a very difficult political climate? A lot could change in the US after the next election. Tesla are building just outside Berlin. Intel have been in Ireland for a long time with a fab lab. They're building another one in eastern Germany and another plant in Italy. But, the mood music around investment coming from the White House could change after the next election. So the question really at the end of the panel description was, how can the UK drive investment, growth and jobs? Well, first of all, I think the key thing, economists, it's always kind of 0.5 of a 5-point plan for economists. And, a lot of trade people just roll their eyes when they hear about this. But the key thing from my perspective is skills, reskilling and education. It's absolutely critical. And I would say, compared to maybe some of the major European economies, it's an even more critical situation in the UK, because productivity lags the other major economies, and because productivity has been stuck in the UK for a long time. When we talk about productivity, people always kind of immediately their mind goes to, the tech, climate, semiconductors, chips, or whatever. And that's one aspect. And in that aspect, the UK is in a battle for global talent. It's in a battle for global talent with the US, with Australia, with major economies in the EU. But there's also a secondary element to that, which I think is probably just as important. If you want to attract the best people, it has to be to a place people want to come to. And that's where public services, quality of life are critically important. And here we have a huge crisis in, call it what you want, the care economy, social care, care of the aged. All the developed economies are getting older. And, just to put a bit of perspective, it's not unique to the UK. Germany, the last business surveys I saw out of Germany, about 45% of firms are struggling to fill skilled jobs. Belgium are leading. Belgium, hardly known as the most dynamic of European economies, is leading missions to Mexico and to India to try and find workers for their care sectors. Ireland reached the point this time, for the first time ever, that 50% of our staff of our public health system, the equivalent to the NHS, are non-Irish, which is an amazing transformation from when we used to send staff in the early days of the NHS. And in Italy, there's 2 million people without a regular family doctor, because the average age of a family doctor is in the 60s, and they just cannot get people to work in these smaller towns and villages. And these sectors are absolutely critical to jobs and growth. The semiconductors, the chips, they might get the headlines, but if you want to get people to come here, the quality of life, that's absolutely critical. So the results of that, I think, one, there is a global battle for people with skills. And I think, with those specific kind of high-tech transition skills. And, I suppose the US universities, maybe the top end of the British education system are very good at that, but it's getting more and more difficult. But equally as important as just kind of attracting that global talent is we need to think about skilling and reskilling existing workers. So if you're working in the Cowley plant, making minis, I'm sure BMW have a plan where they will reskill as we go to electric. But not everybody is so lucky to work in that type of environment. And what we really need to talk about are the young people who are outside of the education or the employment or the training net. Because, you know, as I said before, not everybody needs to be a coder, not everybody needs to, you know, write AI programs or whatever. But what everybody will need, and probably needs already, is a level of functional digital literacy. Because it really doesn't matter now whether you're working in Tesco or whether you're working in a warehouse or whether you're working in Next. You will need a level of basic functional digital literacy. And that is, I think, you know, exceptionally important. And just if we turn it to the UK, I can say, you know, the Irish didn't have any great foresight, but I think we knew that Brexit would be a bad idea for everybody. But alas, here we are, so we have to move on. I think, as was said already, British comparative strengths, energy, definitely. Shouldn't be afraid. I know it's not popular. Shouldn't be afraid to sweat the assets in the North Sea for the next decade or two till we move towards the transition. Already a European leader in offshore wind. Nuclear, traditional and fusion, decided not to join the EU pan-EU programme on fusion nuclear technology. I think that's perfectly reasonable if Britain thinks it can leverage its strengths in that area. And I would throw in one more topic to that, which is probably nobody in the Conservative Party wants to talk about, which is onshore wind. But Ireland has gotten to about 30 or 35% of its electricity supply just with onshore. So there's a huge potential there. I would say it's an old chestnut, but I wouldn't underestimate it. The City of London, the expertise, the institutional memory is huge. Several niches can be exploited there. Green finance technology, Islamic finance, you name it, there's countless niches that can be exploited. I would say we shouldn't underestimate, and here I talk about the Anglosphere in general, the US and the UK, I would say that they possess greater flexibility in the long run over the more central, higher taxed continental economies. But just to finish, I don't want to speak for too long, but I think we need to be realistic as well. Any of the British challenges that we're talking about, productivity, stuff like this, they all predate Brexit. Brexit might have magnified them, might have amplified them, might have made them worse, but all these challenges were still there. The special relationship with the US, it's nice, but it's a red herring. You know, you go to Poland, they talk about their special relationship with the US. You go to Italy, Ireland, wherever. It's a red herring, and it's not the economic answer. As was previously mentioned, public debt will be a constraint, particularly in the short term, because the UK has such a high proportion of its national debt in index-linked bonds, and because of the current situation. And the final thing I would say is that, you know, when we talk about relations with the EU, we should be talking about a mutually beneficial relationship. Maybe I'm the only person in Britain who thinks that, you know, Keir Starmer is actually very clever not to be talking about this. I think it suits Keir Starmer that Rishi Sunak has brought Britain back into Horizon 2020, because possibly in a year or two, who knows, the Labour Party might talk about rejoining Erasmus or whatever, and suddenly it's a little incremental process. Yeah, that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Owen. Well, thank you, everyone, all the panelists. I found that really informative and very, very interesting, not least because we went a layer down into those things to think about in terms of productivity and trade performance, such as attracting talent, immigration, and even issues like childcare will be relevant here for demographics and making sure that you have a strong domestic economy that enables you then to have a strong export base. But I think at this point we will turn to the floor. So if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, please do put your hands up now. Yes, the microphone is just coming so that Bruce can hear you.
Thank you. Do any of you think that when Obama was president and warned us specifically that if we took the decision to leave the EU, you could forget about the US wanting to use Britain as its sort of front entrance to the EU? Do you think that has any relevance these days?
A great question to kick off. Bruce, shall we start with you, and then perhaps I'll turn to you, Sam, and then you, Owen.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it's already happening. I think the Biden administration has begun to use Berlin more as its entry point into the EU, but it also takes the EU much more seriously than some previous administrations in terms of the EU bureaucracy, the importance of the EU, the European Parliament. There's a growing appreciation over time of the importance of Brussels in a context which I would say 20 years ago was just a nuisance, and now people understand they have to deal with Brussels. But to the extent that the U.S. uses a relationship with a national capital to pursue its interests in the EU, for understandable reasons, that can no longer be London, and it's increasingly Berlin.
Sam.
I think it's just observationally, as Bruce has said, the answer is yes, to a degree, although I think you can then disaggregate slightly by types of interactions. So, for example, on certain national security issues, the UK still remains one of the first people the US would talk to in Europe. However, that even then you have to break down further, because if you then talk about economic security in the context of semiconductors, it's interesting that the US isn't even talking to the EU there, it's talking in Europe to the Netherlands, right? Because actually in terms of the actual products they're focusing on, so high-end semiconductors, the only real player in Europe is ASML, which is a Dutch firm that makes the lithographic equipment that produces them. So all of the US pressure has been on the Netherlands, and the EU doesn't have competency in that area. So it's actually bypassed the EU on that. But generally speaking, I think yes, and you can see this in certain interactions. So if we think about data transfers, so the US has been trying to resolve its issues with the EU for a long time in respect to the transfer of personal data across the Atlantic. And it has finally progressed to the point where there is now a new adequacy agreement that can allow this to happen. There was news yesterday that a French MEP is going to bring a legal challenge against it, so it might fall away. But the reason I'm bringing this up is the actual dynamic around this in terms of the UK was interesting, where over the summer, just at the beginning of the summer, the Prime Minister went over to the US and announced that we have our own digital framework, and as part of that, there's going to be a UK-US adequacy framework. But then you look at the small print, and it's linked explicitly to the EU one. So it was the EU adequacy agreement first, UK second. And then you see this with the steel and aluminium talks. So this is to find a permanent resolution to the Trump-era tariffs on steel and aluminium. The US and the EU are discussing at the moment I've just blanked on the acronym, it will come to me, the Agreement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminium. And the idea is that once that's created, other countries, e.g. the UK, could plug in. But it's not that the UK is not important, it's just in terms of who do you speak to first? Who do you try to resolve the issue and then try it with, and then try and sort of incorporate others later? And it's not even, this happens to Japan as well. It's not sort of the US being particularly sort of offensive towards the UK. It's just sort of saying, where's the biggest problem we need to resolve? We'll do that first. UK next. However, with caveats, as I mentioned, there are areas where this approach doesn't apply.
So can we expect to see a UK-US trade agreement anytime
Oh,
soon?
so this is actually, so it's because the quote that actually got bandied around in the press was Obama saying the UK was back of the queue in terms of a trade agreement. And here I actually think the reason the UK doesn't have a trade agreement with the US is entirely to do, not entirely, largely to do with the fact that the US, under this administration, not wanting to do free trade agreements with anyone. That isn't a UK-specific issue. I actually think, in terms of Congress right now, the UK is one of the only countries the US could do a free trade agreement with, given that it would probably have support of both Democrats and Republicans, and there aren't concerns around dumping in terms of labour or offshoring of labour, and those sorts of issues don't apply. It would be difficult on the UK side because we have quite European sensibilities in respect of food and the like, and anyone who remembers the EU-US negotiations and talks, I can see some nodding, of sort of chlorinated chicken and hormone beef, that all comes into the papers, and everyone forgets it was the Daily Mail that came up with the term frankenfood in respect of GM, so it points to it not being a sort of confined to the left of politics, these concerns. So I actually think a trade agreement between the UK and US is something that is still possible at some point. But it probably requires a greater realignment, a change in approach on the US side, at which point the UK would probably be quite up for it. Even under Labour, although it has different, if there were a Labour government, it has different complications there. But if you have Biden and Starmer, some really weird trade agreement that doesn't do anything for trade, it's not impossible to envision.
If you told me that I've spent 5 years of my professional career talking about chlorinated chicken, I definitely wouldn't have believed you. Owen, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah.
No, just that I agree with what's been said. But yes, I still don't think all is lost. But I think that moment, it was that kind of a Obama moment with TTIP, was kind of the final death throes of these big, huge, encompassing trade agreements. So I would say, rather than talking about this huge, EU or this huge UK-US trade deal to go the sectoral approach, which would probably be, probably be more acceptable to the US. The UK is still key on security and defence. It's the one. As Rory Stewart mentioned this morning, it's the one area, say with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was the one area where there was a very clear British position. I would always argue that now, in the current context of the EU and how everything has changed over the last decade, Britain's obvious allies, friends in the EU would be along its outer rim, both westwards, but predominantly in the east with the new Europe of Donald Rumsfeld, and I think British actions in Ukraine, and even their security guarantees to Finland and Sweden in advance of NATO membership, have brought a considerable amount of goodwill in that area.
Could I just add to that? 'Cause
Sure.
that's an excellent example of where the UK still has played quite a dominant role. So even pre-Windsor Framework, so post-Windsor Framework, it's become much easier for UK officials in Brussels. People will talk to them. They're not. The institutions were banned from official meetings with UK folk for quite a long time, and even after the Windsor Framework, that took a little while to feed through into any concrete change. But one of the exceptions to this was coordination around sanctions in respect of Russia, where it's where you had a sort of quad meeting between the Japanese, UK, US and Commission on a regular basis to coordinate and discuss this, to the point where the UK knew what was going to happen before EU member states did in some instances. And that was sort of born of necessity and need, but it does show sort of the importance the UK plays and the role it can play in respect of sort of really quite important issues on occasion.
Thank you, Sam. I think there were a couple of questions here in the front. Just here in the front row, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Owen mentioned sources of future growth, and he mentioned the City of London and financial services, and he said there were a number of niche areas that could be exploited, like Islamic finance, for example. I'm sure that's true. But I wonder what Owen and the others would say about the position of financial services, because We all know what Boris thought about that. And financial services were largely ignored, as far as I understand it, in the negotiations with the EU. The UK stock market is now 3% of global market capitalization. And it's really struggling. It's struggling to attract IPOs. ARM's just gone to New York for very understandable reasons. What do you think the future of the city is? What can be done to put some life back into it?
Yeah, well, I think the problem is here we're still viewing kind of the city as a competitor with New York, and I think no European centre, no non-American global centre can compete with that anymore. I think during the early days of Brexit, during the Brexit campaign, there was certainly a feeling in continental Europe that one big centre would emerge to compete with the City of London. Would it be Frankfurt? Would it be Paris? But that's not happened. What you've actually seen emerge is a couple of centres. But because the key services are distributed between these services, the size is dispersed. So the City of London still ranks quite highly. Obviously the key issue for the City of London is passporting to the EU markets. I think that's a critical I don't even have the word to describe it, but it's just kind of like critical to the long-term sustainability of having a really kind of successful global centre financial markets in London. With regard to the FTSE and the market capitalisation, it's a problem that other big European economies are seeing as well in the Netherlands, in France. I think the problem is that in this day and age, access to finance is everything. People just cannot get the money. These startups, they just cannot get the money, cannot monetize in Europe, which is leading to the exodus to the US in particular.
Sam, you're an expert in trade and services. I mean, we've talked here about passporting into the EU as one way of stimulating economic growth through a UK advantage, comparative advantage in financial services. Do you think there's anything else that the UK could be doing? I'm thinking perhaps about FTAs or regional trade agreements that is joining. Do you think that those will be able to contribute in a significant way?
So let's start with the EU, because I actually think the post-Brexit arrangements for financial services in respect of UK sort of established firms is slightly misunderstood in that I was completely right that passporting ended on day one, but actually what you then saw were individual regulators across the EU take slightly different approaches in terms of the obligations they placed on firms that used to settle in from the UK afterwards. So nearly universally, they required these firms to establish some sort of subsidiary within a given member state. Once you've established that subsidiary, you can sell, for the most part, across the rest of the EU. But the actual requirements placed on those firms varied in terms of staffing levels, in terms of services offered, in terms of amount of capital you had to have, whether you had to have a board meeting there. So all of these things changed, and most firms were given time to adjust. So in the first instance, it was, well, you need some salespeople, you need a subsidiary, you need an office. Over time, we want to see some of your trading. Over time, we want a bit more of this over time. But actually, because of COVID, the pressure actually wasn't put on firms initially. There was sort of everyone was given a longer grace period. But in the last year or so, you've seen, so there's this dreaded, as it sort of described, ECB desk mapping exercise, where they sort of tried to work out exactly how many people everyone had. And so the pressure has sort of been ramping up. But I think then because of that, we've also discovered some areas where the UK has advantages that can't easily be sort of taken away from it. So one of the areas is in fund management, where there was a big discussion in the EU around delegation. So you now have to set up, you say, your fund in Luxembourg or Ireland, but as of now, lots of these funds are still managed from the UK. And the French, for example, wanted this to stop. You should be managed by someone based within Europe. But the Irish and the Luxembourgians said no, because actually we don't know how we could design such a regime that discriminated solely against the British, but not people in Hong Kong, people in Singapore, people in New York. And we don't want to do that because actually it works quite well. And so that's still here. So you still have fund managers in the UK running funds, essentially, that are established in the continent. You have commercial insurance, something that doesn't get talked about very much, but the sort of Lloyd's of London ecosystem is really hard to displace and wrench elsewhere because it's got expertise, it's got niches upon niches upon niches that are quite, and essentially there's just a grey area fudge at the moment that no one talks about, and it works. And there's no actual real clarity on how it works, and that's fine, and no one's going to prod it too much. Then you also have clearing. So one of the two areas where we do have equivalence was clearing, and the issue there is: does any member state want to take on the contingent liability of sort of clearing on that size? Because if it goes wrong, it could go spectacularly wrong, and the UK will bail it out. But with the Dutch. I mean, I think probably the Germans would, but or the French would, but it's what you found is actually some of this stuff is hard to move, and I've sort of been rambling on, so I'll actually stop there. But
and then final question about other sources of financial services growth for UK trade.
Well, the answer was China, right? That was the answer in terms of your offshore hub for sort of currency clearing, and that's not as easy now. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge. I mean, I'm not a gloomer on this. I think the city will be fine. I just don't think it'll be quite as prominent as it would like to be, right? Which is a relative comparison. But they're still going to have lots of people doing stuff, lots of growth deriving from it, lots of tax revenues deriving from it. And we will see, and you listed some of the things it might try and expand into.
We've got time for a couple more questions. I know there was one here at the front you've been waiting to ask.
I'm Fiona Reeves-Arden, and thank you. I'm Fiona Reeves-Arden, and I was just wondering, as we're here, and thank you for all the interesting conversation and explaining to us, you're well versed with trade. What is our Prime Minister currently going to bring back trade-wise, do you think, from India? And his heritage will possibly help, I don't know. And what will the others bring back from India?
Sam, do you want to kick that off? And then Owen,
so the heritage point is interesting, actually, because up until, I would say, late spring this year, there was a reluctance from Number 10 to engage forcefully with the India negotiations because of the fear that the Prime Minister might unfairly be accused of sort of doing essentially his wife's family a favour. And there has been some reporting to this effect in recent weeks. The Observer had a piece, I think, a week and a half ago, sort of with a focus on Infosys, which is, so that was a lingering concern. That has now dissipated, and Number 10 has been very engaged with the negotiations, but they are difficult. And the press always goes on about visas. And there's nuances to this in that actually the UK's post-Brexit immigration regime is viewed very favourably by India. There are just concerns that the new regime might be changed. So you want some reassurances in a treaty to say that, for example, for post-work study, post-work visas for graduates, that they won't have the conditions tightened or removed. And so there's some things there, but there's just the basic issues around India is a fairly closed economy. The UK wants more access. The Indian government don't want to give that much. It's actually quite a classic trade negotiation in that front. And at a technical level, they've reached an impasse, but there won't be an agreement, I think, based off this visit. But he might go back in a couple of months' time where there could be. But it's entirely contingent on Sunak and Modi saying, we want an agreement, we're going to announce it, and then you probably have another 6 months of sorting out the technical detail. So it's possible. I think it's still possible, but it requires significant political intervention.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add.
Bruce, I don't know whether you have anything to add. I know that the US's trade relationship with India is very different to the UK's.
Well, yeah, no, I think the experience in dealing with the Indian government on trade issues that predates the Modi regime is something we have to remember, that as Sam said, these negotiations have always been fraught. I was for many years a journalist, and I vividly remember writing easily 20 years ago about how the EU was going to strike a trade deal with India, and the US better get its act together and do one too. And the EU is still negotiating with with India on a trade deal. My prediction would be, given how basically protectionist the Indians have historically been, that even if there's a deal, it will be fairly light and superficial and not a deep trade agreement. And if I had to place money on this, that we won't see one at all. And because the Indian officials that I've dealt with over the years basically are under political pressure not to open the economy sufficiently. And, they have huge underemployment issues that they can't solve. And they face the challenge that historically, both, in England, in Europe, in the United States, in China, you went through a period of labor-intensive manufacturing, which could then benefit from trade access around the world. Given the way manufacturing is structured these days, the quality demands are such that you have to have enormous amounts of automation. I mean, I once visited it was a factory making the radiator caps for all General Motors cars in the world. Radiator cap is not exactly a terribly sophisticated thing. All of the radiator caps in the world were being made, for General Motors, were being made by 15 people. And even I, as an amateur, saw that at least some of those jobs could be automated. And this is the challenge India faces, is that the quality demands of the global market are such that labor-intensive manufacturing is not going to be possible in all sorts of areas. And as a result, they're not going to get a lot of jobs out of opening up the economy. And this is the challenge they face. Not to excuse their reluctance to open their economy, but there are complications there that even China didn't face.
Thanks, Bruce. We did start a couple of minutes late, so if there are any other questions from the floor, if not, I might just ask one final question to our panelists. It's a big year in terms of elections next year. We've got a European election, a UK election, and a US election. I wonder whether you guys could give your views on what we can expect in terms of trade policy.
Yeah. Who's going to win it all?
Bruce, should we start with you? You've probably got a good story to tell.
Well, I was going to say, if I knew, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I'd be in Las Vegas placing some bets, Look, the polling data suggests it's going to be a very close election. And the election is highly likely to be between Biden and Trump again. We don't know whether the support for Trump will be eroded a bit by all of, he's now, been charged with 91 felonies in 4 different cases. And yet it hasn't really dented his Republican support. But the polls show it's a very close race, and the American public, for reasons I fully can't explain, do not feel that Biden has handled the economy well. And, factually, that's just not true. The economy is doing very well. Unemployment rate is very low. Inflation is coming down. Lots of growth relative to the past. And yet, average people don't credit Biden. So I think it's going to be a very close race.
Sam.
I'm going to give you a conditional answers. So if Trump, from a US perspective, continuity in terms of the drivers of the trade policy for most of the world, but much more erratic. As in, we'll be back to watching his Twitter feed to see who he's applied tariffs to today. You'd expect that the discussion with the EU would fail and we'd have tariffs back on on EU stuff. And then I think you've got this whole other bucket of what happens in respect of Ukraine, which I think would be potentially quite messy and not very good. But the drivers around China and stuff are sort of similar because there's been quite a lot of continuity with the Biden administration from Trump. In terms of the UK, if Labour, I think you have deepening of ties with the EU, but it will be a bit more complicated than they thought it would be, because you'll just have the Conservative Party in opposition sort of calling them traitors every time they do anything, because you're in opposition and that's what you do. And then when in opposition, whatever the government's doing is bad, and Labour do this with, it's just the reverse. But in terms of the rest of the world, I think you'll see, if Labour, some sort of failed attempt to replicate the worker-centred trade policy of Biden, trying to sort of somehow do Biden-y type trade policy things of more local content, more subsidisation, but it won't quite work because, as discussed earlier, the UK is different from the US.
Owen.
Yes, I think Biden will win. I think he'll win narrowly if he is still in the land of the living for the election. I think if Biden were to pass away, I think it would become considerably harder for the Democrats. I think Kamala Harris is very unpopular, and then you just have to take your pick from the other applicants. My reading, just from talking to people around the UK, is that it will be a Labour Party government, probably with the biggest majority for a Labour Party everywhere. Historically, I just have that feeling of the mood, particularly in places like Scotland. I think Labour will gain a lot of seats from the SNP. I think the SNP fever has broken with Sturgeon. She was a remarkable politician in many ways, but I think that kind of thing has broken. I think where the really messy result will be actually in the European Parliament in 2014, where the EPP, the centre-right, are going to lose some seats. The centre-left may hold, but might lose some seats as well. The Greens are going to lose. And I think those on the right, the ECR, so, the Polish government party, Meloni in Italy will gain, and even the far-right ID, even further right ID will probably be constant or maybe hold a little more. So that's going to be interesting to get the centre-right, centre-left consensus that has run the European Parliament since 1979 is becoming more and more difficult.
Thank you. Well, I certainly enjoyed that. Thank you to all of our panellists. That was hugely informative and interesting. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
James?
I suppose I want to just say a few words. Frank, are you there? Yeah. I thought you were going to do this. No, we're going to do it. Oh, okay, fine. Well, there we go. I'd just like to say, I think, a few concluding words of this part of our programme, because obviously, as we make our way into the heat of the remaining heat of the day, and then into the evening, we will be then at Oriel College, and that'll be cabs and other ways of transport to be able to get there. The reception starts there at 7 o'clock, so we have, I think, a bit of time to be able to do so. But as we leave this particular part of our programme, a phrase came, which I thought was a very nice one, Michael, with you, that we understand why Rory is such a driven individual now, that his father had felt that he was going to be in a world of excellence. And the word resonated with me today because I think we have been living in the world of excellence today. Excellence reflected in three different ways. Excellence, I think, firstly in terms of content, where our content for our digital discussions, content as we saw this afternoon for our economic one, has been second by none, and I'd like to thank us, all of you all applaud those people who have provided that content to us today. Second, of course, are the people themselves. I mean, because you can have content, but it's evidently not necessarily the case that when content is given, unless you have some semblance of belief, energy, enthusiasm, and commitment. And to be honest, the ways in which speakers and others have fed into it, and also from the floor as well, I think we'll find once we go through the recordings. And an example of this was Tony Hall saying to me, look, I'm on the, as you know, the House of Lords Committee. I'd really like all your material from the digital thing this morning, because it was such a rich debate. Then we'll be able to use this material in a different type of way. So the second applause goes to the speakers and the content, the speakers themselves and the people. And the last but not least is the organization. And the organization, for an organization like ourselves, who actually doesn't have a director general, it may be quite a thought that do organizations need director generals if you can produce a product like this without any staff? But the fact is that we have fantastic people who give their time voluntarily, and others. So first of all, Frank, to you, to have hosted us here in this wonderful new building. It's the jewel in the crown in Oxford, I think. I mean, of course, a lot of people in the colleges won't like my saying that. But one or two words of saying, well, we didn't know this existed. I said, well, if you're nice to Frank, you might be able to host you things rather than having to be in a rather 20th century building when you can be in a 21st century one. So that's my first port of call. Thank you, Frank, and all the people in Unipart. Thank you very much indeed. My second thank you is to Ian and his team, who I think all of you will have been immensely impressed by the numbers of communications that you've had in your letterboxes in recent days telling you how the things are going to be done. But it's been second by none, Ian. Thank you very much indeed, and we so much value. You've been with us ever since the beginning of the Ideas Network. We did our first Summer University at Rhodes House. So the fact that you have this extraordinary ability to be able to deliver things and to make it understandable for us, thank you very much indeed. And I think that the last thing is to thank you all very much indeed for having come in the first place, because without you, we wouldn't have had actually a seminar at all. So to the fact that we've been able, as an Ideas Network 2030, to have, in the words of which we'll hear from our president this evening, of Damien Green, of our ability not so much to focus on the present, but to focus on the future. That's what we're here for, is to be able to delve into those subjects which will probably leave a number of people feeling uneasy about living with AI, but sorry guys, it's going to be there, and it's going to be very much in terms of being able to think of how we understand it better. So hopefully this day has been able to provide that, and so thank you all very much indeed for coming. And we cut, and we now go out into the sunshine. Thank you all very much.